Okay, yeah, so I'm going to, well, you can see my title. That's where you've come. I'm going to talk about archaeological evidence for the origins of agriculture and crop domestication in India, and then China, and then a little bit in Western Asia. And then I'm going to try to move on to thinking about some broader comparative patterns, which are slightly more global. So yeah, so here's a sort of outline of where we're going. I'm going to start by introducing you to what I consider the sort of three orthodoxies of agricultural origins. And these are things that I was taught as a student, and I used to teach my students when I first started teaching, but I think that we can question all of them now. And then I'll work through defining domestication, very briefly what is it that I do, archaeobotany, and then we'll go through some regional sort of quick case studies, India, early rice in China, a bit on Western Asia, the Near East, and then we'll look at comparative issues of the pace of plant domestication. And what I'm going to hypothesize represents the end of the prehistoric domestication era. Okay. So just a bit of a sort of general background to frame this. As all of you probably know, agriculture represents a modified landscape, a human-managed and controlled landscape that represents a major change between a species, our species, and the natural world. Now, if we put that in a kind of geological time scale, estimates of the age of our species, anatomically modern humans, are about 200,000 years, and farming's only been around for, at most, 10 or 11,000 years. And so that's less than 5% of our species' history. But for most of the world, it's much more recent than that, more like 4,000 years. And for some continents like Australia, it's even much more recent than that. And so what that means is that agriculture is a relatively recent phenomenon, innovation, but it's really changed the world. And if we think in terms of human populations, estimates for 10,000 years ago range between 5 and 10 million people globally, and we're looking at 7 billion today. So agriculture made that possible. Now, the best way to get at, so I think it's an interesting thing to study and to understand, because it's obviously changed the world and is the basis of the cultural world we live in today. Archaeobotany is one of our methods to get at the origins and development of agriculture by directly looking at the preserved plant remains. And so that's what I'm going to look at today. So what are these three orthodoxies? I take circa 1999, because that's when I finished my PhD, and shortly after that I started lecturing. And these are things that more or less I believed at that time. And they're still pretty standard fodder for textbooks. So one view is that there are just a few centers of agricultural origins, and I'll show some maps in a bit, but this varies between 3 to maybe 10. I'm going to question that today. And that domestication was a rapid process, so that once people set out to cultivate plants, they set out to domesticate them. It was a very quick evolutionary process with estimates of the change in plants taking place between 20 and 100 years, so just one or a few human generations. In this sense, it was really a revolution, but I think we can now question that. And then domestication, it's often said, was synchronous globally. So it happened in a few places, and it happened rapidly, and it happened right at the end of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Holocene, in geological terms, so around 11,000 years ago. And this, because it was rapid and synchronous, it was very easy to have simple explanations like climate change caused it. So anyway, so those are the things we'll set in the background, and we'll work our way through whether it's still reasonable to believe them all. But it's useful to start with a few definitions, because these things are used differently in some contexts. But cultivation, I will restrict to human behavior, human practices. So cultivation is when people start to manage the soil and to plant seeds in it. So it's really a shift. We're looking for a shift in how humans are behaving. Domestication is the resulting changes in the plant. So domestication are changes in the adaptations of plants, which are driven ultimately by genetic changes. So changes in the genomes of the plants involved. That immediately means that we have a kind of cause and effect, but it's not an immediate thing. So to have cultivation doesn't mean you have domestication in the species. And then agriculture is really a change in scale. It's a change in the landscape in which you start to have majorly modified landscapes and human economies that are really dependent upon cultivated and domesticated species. And I think I'll be able to show that each of these, we can now start to track each of these and see them as a sequence of of events in the history of this in different regions. So thinking a bit about plant domestication, it's worth thinking through what we can look for archaeologically that we can recover with current methods. So domestication traits are things that have been selected for by the activities of people, of sowing, of tilling soil, of planting seeds, of harvesting, and then, of course, planting the next season out of those stores of those previous harvests, so that there's a kind of accumulative process. So there's two sets of selection pressures. One has to do with the soil conditions in the cultivated field, and one has to do with harvesting methods. And although not everyone would agree, it's generally possible to think of these as unconscious selection. So people consciously set out to cultivate plants, but they didn't set out to change their genomes and make them into domesticated species. We may be able to do that today with hindsight, but I don't think they did that at the beginning of the process. Okay, so one of the key changes is a change in seed dispersal, and we can see that very clearly in things like the cereals. So in the background, we have a sketch of a wheat ear, and in wild wheat, the spikelets come apart, and each of those spikelets contains a couple of grains normally, and it comes apart when they're mature. And what that leaves behind is on the rachis that attaches those ears, little scars. And you can see a flat scar here from an early archaeological, in this case, a barley rachis. And so those come apart. They dehisce naturally. In the domesticated one, that's been turned off. And we know increasingly, we know the genes involved in that increasingly. So there's a mutation that prevents that shattering. And that, of course, is very bad for natural seed dispersal, but it's very good if you're being harvested by a farmer who's going to plant you later. And we can see that archaeologically in things like this example of a barley rachis, where you have the torn off base of the rachis and the torn off base of the mixed rachis, right? And that actually means that has been threshed. So rather than having natural seed dispersal, you now have human labor, human activities of threshing and winnowing that separate the spikelets and the grain. Now, archaeologists have known for a long time that potentially we could study it in this way, but we simply didn't have the data to actually look at this process until relatively recently. And the best studied part of the world for the origins of agriculture is the Near East, Western Asia, where wheat and barley are domesticated. And what this chart shows is the number of published, quantified rachises of einkorn wheat and barley based on some years of publication date over time. And what you can see is it's really only in the last decade or so that we've started to have a large body of this kind of data. And that's because these rachises are small, so that you have to have very careful recovery methods on site. And also, it took a while for archaeobotanists to actually work up the criteria for separating these things and get used to it. Now, prior to there being a lot of data, there was certainly room for experimentation and speculation. And one of my predecessors in this field, Gordon Hillman, who used to teach in London, where I teach now, did a number of experiments in the 1980s. And here he is harvesting wild einkorn wheat, in one case with a basket and a wooden paddle, in another case with a sickle made with stone tools, or reconstructed ancient sickle. And so he did these experiments and then looked at, in this control population, whether he could get some mutant types in wild einkorn that were non-shattering. And he did get a few, and so from those few, he was able to calculate up how long it would take if you were sickle harvesting and then sowing from that to domesticate a population of wild einkorn. And he came up with an estimate of 20 to 100 years. So this is where this estimate comes from. And other people had also suggested that it could be a very rapid process. So what's interesting to think about is that theoretically, it's quite a rapid process. But the actual evidence we have suggests it was not a rapid process. And of course, he was doing an experiment that sort of with hindsight, that if we wanted to domesticate it by this way, we could. So you can make all sorts of assumptions about what people did. But the archaeological evidence, as I'll show, doesn't fit this. It takes thousands of years, which implies that the human practices involved were perhaps less intentional, and we need to think about other factors that go into them. In some ways, the role of sickles has been overstated. So early sickles in Western Asia look like this one on the top in the Near East. But the thing is, finds of these predate agriculture by a couple of thousand years. And so that implies that those sickles are actually being developed for some other purpose, cutting reeds for thatch, cutting reeds for basket material, and so forth. So they're being used for harvesting plants, but they're probably not developed for the purpose of harvesting cereals. That's transferred later. When you take the case of China, early, they don't really have sickles early on, but early on they have harvest knives, and this is a stone knife, and those tools, two holders so you can tie a string or a leather strap to it and attach it to your hand, and you can harvest the heads of millets or the heads of rice. And in the rice area where we have rice domestication, these things first appear only at about 3000 BC. And as I'll show, that's several thousand years after rice is already domesticated. So they domesticate rice without a sickle or the equivalent. So I think this means that sickles are not actually the key factor here. Although, again, that's one of our orthodox. Another thing that we can look for archaeologically, in addition to the rachis remains, are seed size. And of course, we find lots of grains and seeds archaeologically, and as anyone who's looked at wild and domesticated crops, and some people in this room obviously have, there tend to be changes with domestication in which domesticated grains get bigger, and they tend to get fatter, not necessarily longer. And if you look at the barley, you've got wild barley on the bottom, domesticated barley on the top. It's about the same length, it's just thicker and fatter. So there's a thickening, an increase in seed volume, but it's not always in all dimensions. And there's often a change in color, but we can't really see color archaeologically, so it's not so useful. But your wild peas and wild lentils and wild mung beans are all black, and the cultivated ones are often green or light red and things like that. But we can certainly measure grains and look for change over time. So those are the two main traits I'm going to look at. But the question you might ask is, why is grain size changing? Now, in a wild context, the assumption would be that seed size is opportunistic. It's adapted to the environment in some way. And so it's stabilized in relation to that ecology. With cultivation, you're introducing a new selective regime in which you have a cleared soil. So there's lots of soil to colonize with the root system, and sunlight to colonize with the root system. And potentially you're also burying seeds more deeply. So this combination of factors gives a impetus for larger seeds, because larger seeds tend to produce larger seedlings, so they can get established in these new environments. So that's our kind of working hypothesis for why seed size should automatically start to change with early agriculture. So again, human practices are very important here in terms of harvesting, although we're not quite sure how they harvested, and in terms of cultivating the soil, but they're not intending to lead to the domestication process. So we can start to think through, and just looking at this chart now, it looks a little bit complicated, but anyways, I won't spend too much time on it. You can start to think through the relationship between morphological changes, which are adaptations, and human behaviors, and these things feed back on each other. So over time, the domestication process as a whole sees an increasing labor investment on the part of people, so they're putting in more and more effort in harvesting and preparing the soil, and this leads to changes in the plant as the plant is adapting to that environment. So seed size increase, domesticated species tend to lose seed dormancy, they develop non-shattering, and of course that feeds back then into people needing to develop better ways of harvesting, like sickles and crop processing. So there's a feedback between the plant adapting to human behavior, becoming increasingly domesticated in terms of change away from the wild species, and human behaviors adjusting to that. So we can think of that as a kind of a process that's entangled, an entanglement process. But as an evolutionary process, we can start to try to quantify how long that takes. And I'll show you some examples here in a minute. But it takes a couple of thousand years, it now looks like. Oh, that had sound effects. I'm not sure why. OK, so I should put that in more of my stuff. Anyway, so now it's a change in chapter. So very briefly, I want to, for those of you who aren't archaeologists or practicing archaeobotanists, give you a couple slides to introduce what is archaeobotany? What is it that this guy at the front of the room is talking about? Now, archaeology, all of you will know, is about the excavation and recovery of the past remains of human activity. Right? So so people excavate sites like this one in Thailand, and you've got the stratigraphy there that goes back through different layers of activity with ceramics and different artifacts in it. And so from this archaeological site, we can recover the plant remains that relate to those past activities. Now, of course, a lot of remains have degraded, biodegraded, disappeared. so forth, but there is material that's there, usually preserved through fire, through contact with fire. So it gets carbonized, it turns into charcoal or partly into charcoal, and you can recover that. Now, it is very small, so if you're digging with picks and shovels or even trowels, you will tend to miss such material. And so what crazy archaeobotanists do like me is we collect large bags of soil, sediment from these different archaeological layers, and we mix them with water, and we see what floats. And what floats tends to be organic remains like charcoal, charred seeds, small bits of rice rachis, and so forth. And so we do flotation, and you can do it with lots of willing workers, so manual bucket flotation is an example in Sri Lanka, or you can build machines which take a lot less work and a lot less hard on the back, but require good sources of diesel pumps or electricity and so forth. So here's an example of a flotation machine. And then that material is caught on a fine mesh, and it goes back to the university laboratory, where we then sort through it and figure out what is in it. Now, 99% of it is wood charcoal, because, of course, people cook with wood. They burn wood, so lots of small fragments of wood. And in amongst all of that wood, you will find seeds, grains, and fragments of other bits of plants that we're interested in. So these are just some examples from rice, but you can see here a carbonized grain and a carbonized rice spikelet. So those are the grain. You can still see the husk patterns on it with the spikelet base there. And then this is a typical example we have. Here's a rice grain, and here's a bunch of spikelet bases. So that little bit where the rice spikelet attaches to the plant is rather small. It's around half a millimeter or slightly smaller, but it's like gold dust if you want to study rice domestication. And now sometimes in low-lying sites, they might be waterlogged. So if you're near sea level and you have permanently wet situations, you can actually get things like this, where you have whole rice husks here, and these are the rice spikelet bases preserved under waterlogging. But that's relatively restricted environments. So globally, we get mostly charred material. Now, another plant microfossil that we can study is phytoliths, and some of us were talking about those this morning. So here again, just keeping rice as our example plant. Many plants, but not all, accumulate silica, and they lay that silica down in their cells and tissues in predictable ways. And so the silica, which is glass, takes on the shape of those cells, and when you burn that plant, the ash is then full of phytoliths from that plant. And also, if you just let the plant decompose in the soil in your settlement, the silica will be left behind. So we can also study that. So here's an example with the rice plant where you've got very distinctive double-peaked phytoliths in the husk. There's the top two, and you get these fan-shaped, what are called bulliforms in the ribs of the leaves. Right, so we can use those to diagnose from phytoliths that rice is present. Okay, so that's my 3 slides on what is archaeobotany. So back to some of our orthodoxies. So a very influential map is this one at the top here, published by Jack Harlan in Science about 45 years ago or something like that now, which has really 3 centers of origin, one in Mexico, one in the Fertile Crescent in Western Asia, and one in China, all of his ones. And then he had 3 what he called non-centers, which were areas that had multiple subsequent domestications somehow influenced by these centers in the savannas of Africa, Southeast Asia broadly, and tropical America. So that's the kind of minimalist view, would be that there's maybe 3 places where agriculture began. This is a kind of mid-90s view, and one still sees maps like this. This particular one is from 2006 with 10 centers. So you can see China's starting to multiply, and South America starting to break apart, and got the strange North American one. I think we now have evidence that points to something closer to 20, and I'll come back to that later on. Now, one of the places that you'll notice is not on these maps is India. So it was not on these maps. It was kind of a blank. And so when I started my PhD, I set off to South India, not necessarily to prove these guys wrong, but I just sort of thought, well, Indian food has some interesting species in it, like mung beans and things, which nobody ever talks about. So where do those come from? And the expectation from this kind of work would be that, well, the earliest agriculture is wheat and barley from Western Asia, or maybe rice from China, and then these other things get added later out of the local flora. So I set off to do a PhD in South India to find this, but that's not actually what I found. Anyway, so this is so in 1997, when I was a bit younger, this was terra incognita. And so we set off to float a number of sites, and there's about 15 sites out of all these dots, which I dug at and floated on myself. We knew a little bit of sites up here, but we basically knew nothing down in this lower area. Now, for archaeologists, it was an interesting region also because it had this area in yellow, this kind of banana-shaped zone, is what was known as the ash mound culture, or the ash mound tradition. So it had a very distinctive early archaeological culture, which had been fairly well studied, but no one had ever bothered to sample for plant remains from those sites. And the reason it was called the ash mound tradition is because the landscape, this South Deccan dry zone in India, is dotted with these mounds. There's one of these ash mounds, and you can see it's maybe 4 meters high or something like that. And that's basically a large accumulation of cattle dung, which has been burnt, and then it's accumulated again and then burnt again. So a number of investigations have worked on these sites, and clearly they had a strong interest in cattle. They had large herds of cattle, and they were burning their dung periodically, seasonally, parts of cattle festivals. And where some sites had been excavated, it was clear that underneath the ash mound you had some sort of a pen. So in this case, you have a stone edge for the fence, and these pens are then rebuilt, and the dung accumulated again. And other sites have post holes that indicate they had fencing and so forth. So you have this importance of cattle in the economy. And then adjacent to these sites, you would sometimes get evidence for a few huts or a bit of human settlement. But people don't just eat beef or milk. They presumably are using plants. So what plants are they using? Are these early farmers? That was the kind of basic question. And could we go and find out? And so we went to a number of the sites in this region, some with ash mounds and some without the ash mounds, and did very small excavations, so little small test pits and things here and there, and did lots of flotation and got lots of plant remains. And the first thing I started encountering were things that looked like these, which are horrible little charred grains of millet, which is not what I was expecting. Not much wheat and barley, no rice, all these horrible little millets. And the first problem was to sort out what on earth these things were. And as one, of course, has heard of millets, but what you don't realize is there's about 12 species of them cultivated in India, often. And many of them are very, very minor and very unimportant today. So I first had to work out identification criteria for separating them. But the one that dominated our samples in South India was this one here, with its companion crop, this one here. So Brachiaria ramosa and Setaria verticillata, but I'll refer to those as browntop millet and bristly foxtail. And we also had lots and lots of pulses. Actually, more important than the millets were legumes. And this included things like the pigeon pea and horse gram, the mung bean, and this one here is hyacinth bean. So we had lots and lots of legumes. So we had a nice balanced diet of millets and beans, as well as their cattle and so forth. But not much evidence for these introduced crops that it was supposed to be based on. So taking that together across all of these 15 sites, essentially it was these 4 species that dominated the archaeological evidence. So these 2 minor millets and 2 pulses. Now it's true that we're still missing the actual transition from when people are pure hunters and gatherers to cultivators in this region, but the earliest sites that we have evidence from indicates that these species are the basis of the diet, and these species are all wild, have wild forms in India, in southern India. And so it seems a pretty obvious thing to conclude that these suggested local domestication processes were of primary importance in this region. And it's worth dwelling a little bit on Brachiaria ramosa, because it's one of the interesting lessons we can learn from archaeobotany about changing preferences for crops and changing importance. This is cultivated today, but it's extremely rare. So there's reports of a few villages essentially on the borders of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka in southern India where people still cultivate it. They cultivate small plots of it. They make little breads, which are used for certain seasonal festivals and things out of it, but it's not a staple crop anymore, so it's on its way out. But archaeologically, when you start looking, it dominates all the early sites in southern India, and it's an important component of sites throughout the peninsula. We have a little bit up in northern India and so forth. So 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, it was a major staple food. It's now retreated to just a few little pockets in a few little villages. So it's very much a relic crop, but one that was well suited to this environment in the past. And so we can find evidence for sort of lost crops and think about whether that means they deserve some more research to see whether they're worthy of reviving a little bit. Of course, that also raises questions about what habitats these crops came from. Today, you'll mostly find Brachiaria ramosa as a weed growing on the edges of of fields of sorghum, things like that. So what is its wild habitat? Well, I think this is as good a guess as any as what its wild habitat might have been, which is a stand where we found bristly fox millet and browntop wild growing together in southern Sri Lanka in kind of this kind of savanna grassland environment. So you can imagine that such habitats, such environments existed in southern India and were being first collected by hunter-gatherers who then began to extend those environments and cultivate and change these plants into domestic. Although we have yet to track that whole process in South India, so there's still work to be done. Now, one of the things I realized, of course, and anyone who looked into it would know, is that for many of these crops domesticated in India, we didn't know very much about where they came from. So no one had really talked about browntop millet and the origins of agriculture. And really things like the mung bean and horse gram hadn't been talked about much either. So we had really good maps of wild wheat and wild rice, but we don't really have good maps for the wild forms of these species. And so that means there's actually a bit of old-fashioned botany to do. Where do these things grow in the wild? And since one can't walk over all the forests and woodlands of India oneself, the best place is to go to herbariums where botanists of the past have collected. So these are just some examples of free-growing wild-type mung bean and horse gram from the Botanical Survey of India Herbarium in Pune. But by putting together these records, you can find out from the labels where people have collected these things in the past and start to put together maps. So here's an example of the map of wild mung bean and its black cousin, the urd bean, and where they kind of occur in India today or have been collected in 20th century wild populations and where they overlap. And that starts to give us a sense of, well, they must have been domesticated somewhere in or near where they're wild, which means it wasn't the Near East, it wasn't China, it was somewhere in India. And then we can start to look at where our early archaeological records are. So you get a clutch of early mung bean finds in the south, the area where I was working. There's also a clutch in the northwest, the western Himalayas. And then for the urd bean, the earliest finds are in this kind of northwestern part of the peninsula. So we can start to see centers of origin for these different crops. And for each of these crops, we can start to look at where those overlap and see where we might be seeing primary centers of domestication. Anyways, I'm very pleased to say that after work in South India, we were able to add South India to the map. So this is a 2007 map from Science of Centers of Agricultural Origins. And for the first time ever, you have mung bean, horse gram, and millets here at 4,500 BP. So we were able to put South India on the map, which I guess is something. In terms of process, there's still stuff we need to understand better. We need to do more research on. But essentially, it looks like these early sites and these dots are these early ash mound tradition sites are focused on what I would call a savanna belt, a savanna corridor down the middle of the Indian peninsula. And the wild progenitors are occurring in the hilly margins, the slightly wetter hilly margins of the savanna corridor. So domestication is taking place along the margins of this savanna zone. And the savanna zone also suits cattle pastoralism, which spreads down from the north. And so you get a mix of local domestication and introduced cattle pasture. So that's one case, and that's a case that maybe we weren't expecting to find. It wasn't on our map of major cropping centers of origin. But one of the crops that is one of our major world crops, and we think we know a lot about it, is rice. And of course, we do know a lot about rice. But even 10 years ago, we didn't know very much about the domestication process of rice. So what was the actual process, the archaeological evidence for its domestication? And so I guess the time was right. And, I found myself in China in 2004, and the time was right to start a project working on rice domestication. In 2004, they just at this little barn here, they'd found below the surface as they were extending this structure, a site that looked like this. Of course, this is after 3 years of excavation. But you can see all these. This is a waterlogged site. So it's below the modern water table. You have preserved posts, and these posts can be lined up into big kind of long houses on stilts. So it's a very impressive site. And of course, the archaeologists locally did a very good job of excavating it. It's got wonderful artifacts. But they weren't sampling for plant remains in 2004. And so I said, well, I said, aha, here's a chance. I should convince these guys to do flotation and sieving, and I'll come back and sit at the microscope and work on this stuff. And here's a chance to look for a site where rice was important early on. One of the first things I noticed as I started looking at the plant remains from the site is it wasn't all about rice. I was finding tens of thousands of acorns, tens of thousands of water chestnuts, trepha, and lots of these urale, another aquatic nut, which the plant looks like here, as well as rice. And so this also led me to start to question the primacy of rice in the economy at this time in this period. So this site is from a culture called the Hemudu culture. Certainly when I was a student of archaeology, it was in all of our textbooks as the early Neolithic of China, Hemudu, intensive rice farming. It's in high school textbooks in Chinese, if you go to high schools in Shanghai and things, as the origins of rice agriculture. And I sort of looked at it with an eye of someone who grew up in California where the native peoples weren't farmers and ate a lot of acorns and said, well, they're eating a lot of these wild nuts. Maybe they're not really farmers. Maybe we should start to question what the evidence is. And the evidence wasn't particularly strong, archaeobotanically, that they were rice farmers. So I published a paper with some colleagues in 2007, which won me a lot of enemies in some parts of China for saying that, well, rice agriculture was later than it was supposed to be. And maybe these guys were in an early stage of pre-domestication cultivation, and they were really mostly gathering acorns from the forest. You know, that's fine to hypothesize, but then you've got to go out and collect the evidence. So what is the evidence? So we did lots of flotation and sieving, and of course we got these little things here, these rice spikelet bases, and this is the base of the rice spikelet. And no one had really looked at these before in China to see what they could tell us about rice domestication. And as I've said before, one of the key changes in cereal crops and mini crops with domestication is a loss of natural seed dispersal. So in the wild rice, and here's a nice example of a wild rice panicle, as the grains mature, they simply come off the plant. Here's one that's fallen onto my hand. Here's one that's falling down here. You still got some green ones on there, but the mature ones have fallen off. So as they're ready, they shatter, they fall into the mud. And that leaves behind a spikelet base, which has a smooth, round scar. And it's an archaeological example, which is why it's, you know, slightly mungy, but there it is, a smooth, round scar. And here's, of course, domesticated rice, whereas the ears fill and the grains fill, they stay on the plant, they get heavier and heavier, and they droop. And then eventually somebody comes along with a sickle or a combine harvester or something and harvests them. So here's a guy harvesting domesticated rice. So they stay on the plant. You can actually make sheaves and dry them in the field and thresh them later. And when you thresh them, that leads to a scar that looks like this. It gets torn out. It gets completely torn out. So wild rice, and we've done some experiments now on wild rice, is very easy to harvest. Wild annual rice is with a basket. You get pretty good yield. There's a whole bunch of spikelets in the basket after just 4 minutes. I think that's after 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And then, and so it's quite a good wild resource. So then the question is, how quickly do people change it from this to this, and why, and when? And so can we look at it? Well, we have a method. We have these spikelet bases. And at Tenlo Shan, once we started a systematic sieving program, it was clear that these things were quite numerous. And so we started to collect them. And these are archaeological examples here where we have the domesticated types, wild types, and then some which which I would classify as immature. So the ones that have come off the plant slightly green. So they have a different fracture pattern with this protruding coated belly button. Anyway, so from Tenlo Shan, we could have the different layers of the site, earlier, middle, and later, and we could count these things up. And they're kind of small and fiddly, but anyways, it took quite a bit of time, but here we go. Over time, what you see is the lower levels of the site. Here you've got a dominance of the wild type, and those decline over time at that site. And here's the domesticated type, the non-shattering type, and those increase over time. And these are the immature ones, so they kind of decline. And of course, if you're harvesting wild rice, you expect to get some of the mature wild types, and then you also knock off some of the green ones. And our experimental harvest of wild rice has shown that that's the case. This is a much later site, the only one I had available at that time, which shows that you've got about 70% domesticated and still a large proportion of wild type, and that's because the weedy rices always kind of infest rice fields. But what this essentially showed us is that this site captured what I would call the tipping point. So the lower levels, domesticated type is less than wild type. The upper levels, domesticated type is more than wild type. The process isn't over. It's somewhere in the middle of this domestication process. But we were able to extrapolate from that and say, well, it's not domesticated in 20 years or 100 years. We're looking at more like 2,000 years. So it's a slow process. Now, subsequent to that, we've worked on a number of sites in the same region of China. And we think the domestication process in terms of non-shattering finishes around 4,000 BC. So after this, half a millennium after that site. And at that time, we start to find some sites where we actually have preserved field systems. So these are a couple examples of those near the modern Suzhou city. And you get the earliest paddy fields are these tiny little things. So these are tiny little fields cut into the sterile soil. And in these fields, you get the remains of rice and also various settlement refuse. So people are manuring these fields or composting these fields by adding sort of midden from their sites. But you can see they're just a few meters across, like 2 meters across. So these tiny, tiny little fields. Now that's quite curious at first, but it starts to make sense if you start to think about the other changes that rice has to undergo. Because one of the challenges with rice is that the rice that people seem to be domesticating in China is not an annual rice, but it's a perennial wild rice. And so within the wild rice complex, as some of you will well know, you have annual forms, and this is Oryza navara, the annual form, and it's growing here in a monsoon mud puddle. So that puddle will dry up, and it's just starting to shed seeds at this point. That puddle will dry up, and in a few months later, all those plants will be gone. Their grains will be in the ground, and that's it. So it produces lots of grains, but it has a kind of 6 or 7 month life cycle. And then this is the perennial Oryza rufipoga, which is growing in permanent water. And so these guys don't produce as many grains. Generally, they will tend to produce more leaves and more shoots. And if they continue to produce more leaves and more shoots, they produce fewer grains. And so to get them to produce more grains, you need to dry them out a little bit, give them just that little bit of extra drought-type stress, and then they should start to produce more grains. So our working hypothesis is that these early fields are partly about controlling water. Because in amongst them, you will get some deeper features. This is one example here. There's one at the edge of this, which are deep kind of holes for draining water out. So you have little fields and then a deep hole attached by little canals. So you can drain the fields, dry them out a little bit, and maybe increase grain production. Of course, as eventually the genetics will catch up to that, and they essentially turn this into more of an annual plant and increase yield through various genetic changes, and then you can move back or move to what we would think of now as larger rice fields. And we have evidence of this from another site in the lower Yangtze area near Hangzhou City, which was excavated about 4 years ago. It's all now sky-rise apartment buildings here now. But anyway, I was lucky to be a little bit involved in the sampling when they were excavating it. So, but you can see here this black soil here is the rice paddy field soils from 4,300 years ago. So for what's called the late Liangzhu period. And when all of the stuff is planted, you've got nice sort of walkways, sort of embankments that run between these field systems. So it's a massive sort of landscape of agriculture. Of course, that's much more what we associate with rice today. So by the time you get to this period, you're looking at really the end of the process, massively transformed agriculture landscapes full of rice paddy field agriculture. And of course, this period, the Liangzhu, is well known to students of Chinese archaeology because it has really elaborate craft production, these jade objects being carved with these very fine kind of faces and gods. It's supposed to be a god with a feathered headdress or something riding a dragon, something like that, and very fine pottery and very large settlements, kind of the first kind of urban-like settlements in the lower Yangtze region. So that's, of course, supported by this agricultural landscape of rice. And so for this region as a whole, we now have a sequence that runs from the domestication process. We may not have the very beginning, but we've got it in the middle. We've got the end with these little field systems, and eventually it intensifies to these massive field systems that support more urban-like populations. Now, through that process, we can go back and ask ourselves, well, what happened to those acorns they were eating at the beginning? And they disappear. The wild foods disappear. So here's a chart from a number of sites in this same region, plotted roughly over time. And the black bar here is just the raw percentage of seeds, which is rice. You can see that this steady march of the increase of rice until it really dominates what you find archaeobotanically. And the orange is the acorns, which are here, and the green is the water chestnuts. The red is this other one that you're always talking about. And so these wild things basically all drop out of the system. So the system in which rice is being domesticated through this process. This is what I call the tipping point. By this time, non-shattering is fixed, and these wild foods just disappear and move into a rice-centered world. So if we think about it in terms of stages, we're looking at early cultivation here, where the plant is still being domesticated. By this point, it's being fully domesticated, and by this time, we've moved into an agricultural world in which the economy is based on these agricultural landscapes of rice. And so what that indicated is it's a slow process. All the steps along the way are a very slow, gradual, evolutionary process. Now, the place that had been best studied for the origins of agriculture is still Western Asia, the Near East, the Fertile Crescent. And as we were working on this stuff in rice, data was being published from the Near East that was suggesting that maybe the Near East was slow too. So maybe it was time to reconsider what was happening in Western Asia as well. And in the last few years, I've gotten involved in a couple of projects out there, because it's all well and good to write about the Near East using other people's data, which is quite a lot of fun, but occasionally you need to feel like you're involved. So I've recently become involved in a project at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, which is near the end of the transition to full agriculture, and a site called Jarmo in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is sort of somewhere in the middle, maybe, early days. But anyways, from existing data in the Near East, there's lots of data. So let's ask this question. What about the nuts? What about the equivalent of acorns in the Near East? Are people using a lot of nuts alongside early cereals? We have lots of available evidence from sites in Western Asia. But what this graph shows, and I'm kind of cluttered, I know, this represents about 1 million seeds or something from various sites, but each of these are different archaeological sites, and the red is just the raw percentage of the crops. So the cereals, and they might still be wild, but the things that become the crops, wheat and barley, and other crops like lentil pea, chickpea, flax, things that come from Western Asia. And then the big blue splodge are fruits and nuts. And in Western Asia, this is mostly things like wild pistachio nuts and wild almonds. Some sites have acorns. And I've included figs in that category as a fruit. And then you've got some sites have wild grasses, small legumes, and so forth. But what you can see is the early sites, these go from earlier to later, Bronze Age there at the end. The majority of plant remains are still wild. And the pre-pottery Neolithic A is what most of your Near Eastern archaeologists and textbooks are saying, that's the beginnings of agriculture. But those guys are still using mostly wild foods. And the cereals don't look domesticated. And even through this period, which is the period when cereals are being domesticated, large proportions of wild food. It's not until the end of the Neolithic where you start to get a lot of sites which are really dominated by the crop. Once you get to the Bronze Age, of course, you never find these nuts and things again. They kind of disappear. So that suggests that there's a similar slow transition away from wild food, cultivated foods in the Near East. So we have to, when we look at the Near Eastern environment, what's often referred to as the Fertile Crescent, these nice oak woodlands, mostly heavily degraded today. So you've got to hunt around for bits that aren't too degraded. This is in Iraqi Kurdistan in the Qaradag Mountains. You can find patches of wild barley in this environment, and wild grapes and wild vetches. But there's a lot of other potential wild foods in these environments. Your wild pistachio nuts, your wild figs, I've listed them as wild almonds, some acorns, wild capers, wild grapes, and so forth. And they also seem to be heavily using, in these early stages, a lot of wetland nutlets. So your knotweeds and your sedges, this is the sea club rush, which form extensive stands in the wetlands, and these are turning up in large quantities alongside the earliest cereals. So there's a real sense in which the earliest cultivation in Western Asia was also a supplement to a broader gathered wild diet. But in the Near East, there's a lot of data where you can start to look at things like, again, rates of change. How quickly do things get domesticated? And so this is a compilation of data looking at sizes in einkorn and immer wheat, so grain breadth here, and this is barley, peas, and lentils. And you can see there's a sort of gradual increase in average size over time. And this is the rachis data, the published non-shattering rachis data. So mostly wild, entirely domesticated, and a gradual transition. So like rice, it's taking a surprisingly long time and a surprisingly similar kind of rate. This is if we plot rice and the Near Eastern stuff together on one graph. So it occurred to me that now it's time to really start compare. We now have enough data for some of these crops. We can really compare them. Is it the same process? Are it the same driving motivations? These are unconnected cultures, but at different times. But are they essentially doing the same sort of process? And I think the basic answer is yes. Essentially, domestication is a similar kind of process each time. And so here we've got the non-shattering, the increase in non-shattering in einkorn wheat. The blue there is immer wheat. So the green is immer wheat, the blue is barley, and this is that Yangtze rice sequence now that we've got for a whole bunch of sites. And this is grain size. What's interesting is if you take the blue there, that's barley, the circles, it increases over these first 3,000 years, and then it levels off and just kind of bounces around. And a lot of these are kind of early Neolithic Europe and things. But essentially for the last 8,000 years, barley hasn't changed much. But in the first, for these 2,000 to 3,000 years, it changes a lot. So there is a kind of window in which all this activity is happening, the domestication episode. And you can look at lots of other crops and do the same sort of thing. So here's our change in seed size of mung bean in South India, or soybean in central China, sunflower in the American Midwest. Something else like domesticated early on in America is called pit-seed goosefoot. Nobody eats it today, but anyway, it used to be a crop. A bit like quinoa, which you can get at some of the restaurants around here. Anyways, it declines in sort of seed coat thickness. So we can start to map these things over time. And of course, if you can look at them across time and population, you can start to try to quantify how much change. And of course, evolutionary biologists have been doing this kind of thing for a while, so we can borrow some things from the evolutionary biology playbook. And there's something called a Haldane rate, which is a way of looking at phenotypic change, so quantifying phenotypic change. And this will then allows you to compare across species and across traits. So how is change in grain size faster or slower than change in non-shattering? And essentially what a Haldane rate is looking at is shifts within a population. So here's most traits have a kind of average and a mean and a range, so a bell-shaped curve at a normal distribution, and a shift if the mean of the population shifts by an entire standard deviation, that would be one Haldane. That's of course massive change. That never really happens. The difference between those two arrows is a 0.1 Haldane rate, right? Anyway, so that's an existing way to do this. So it seems maybe we could try this with archaeobotanical data, because of course it's dated, so we can put it on time. And you get some fairly interesting results. So this is just comparing a few. So the sort of regression line for a Haldane rate in einkorn wheat, barley, rice. Imra is a bit slow, but the data is a bit weak. And then we've done that for grain size change as well. And what we find overall, interestingly, is that things cluster. So this is sort of Haldane rates for various crops, but you've got the non-shattering up at the upper end in a kind of cluster, and then about an order of magnitude slower change in grain size. So a whole bunch of different species. What's interesting is across different species, across legumes and cereals, things like grain size are changing at roughly similar rates. So that suggests that there's something maybe in the genetic architecture of these traits, in the nature of the kinds of selection pressures that it's possible, it's feasible to exert on these things under early cultivation conditions are similar. So there's something similar. I think we're still at the stage of just trying to gather this data, and now we can start to think about what it means. But it does suggest that domestication was slow, but similarly slow in different parts of the world. Okay, so changing gears. So thinking about pace of domestication, right? We can look at the domestication of individual crops, how long it takes them to change. But how can we look at this globally? Can we look at this globally? So it occurred to me the way to think about it is how many things are being domesticated at any one time. So things come into cultivation, pre-domestication cultivation, then they go through a domestication episode, and then once they're fully domesticated, they're a crop, and they become a crop that spreads, that diversifies, that may undergo some breeding, but it goes kind of post-domestication improvement. So this chart is a first attempt to try to map that globally. So this is globally for grain crops. So by grain crops, I mean cereals, pseudo-cereals like buckwheat or quinoa, and pulses, the grain legumes. And now for some species, we don't really have good data for the domestication episode. We can't map that whole process, but we have pretty good data for when it's finished and when those things are fully domesticated. And so anyway, so this is what the data looks like. Now, I've had to exclude some species where we simply don't have enough data, so I've excluded 11. But there's 66 for which we have a reasonable amount of data. And there's some stuff that's domesticated early. So this is like the South American phaseolus beans, which are claimed to be very early. This is your wheat and barley and lentils, your maize, your Chinese millets, your rice, and things like the zuki bean, and then your African millets and Indian millets and buckwheat and so forth later on. So there's a series of different species in here that come into the kind of domesticated world, the agricultural world at the same time. But what's interesting is it kind of breaks up into 4 phases, I would suggest. So there's an early phase, the early Holocene. This is when we used to be taught everything happens in the early Holocene. Actually, not very much happens in the early Holocene. A few places domesticate a few species, and that's very interesting. But most species are domesticated later than that. So if we look at the early Holocene, there's only an average of 4 grain crop species domesticated per millennium. Interestingly, once you move into the early mid-Holocene, there's a kind of plateau phase, which I can't really explain. People stop domesticating new species globally for a while. Why that should be, I'm not sure. But in the later mid-Holocene, between about 6,500 years ago and 4,000 years ago, or 3,500 years ago, lots and lots of domestication. So almost nine new species being domesticated, 9 or 10 being domesticated per millennium. And then things really slow off. And in the last few thousand years, there are very few new grain crop domestications. So I tried to play a similar game with a colleague with animals recently. I thought, okay, this is kind of fun. Let's see what it looks like. And again, it's a similar sort of pattern. We know dogs are really early. They're 30,000 years old. So they're the kind of ultimate domestic animal model. But most animal domestications are relatively recent. They're kind of middle Holocene in the last 6,000 years. Early on, there's a few. There's sheep, goat, and cattle. There's the Chinese pigs. But most of your animal domestications are later. There's this kind of intensification of domestication processes globally starting around 6,000 years ago. So for my money, that means it isn't start of the Holocene. It isn't synchronous in terms of the very beginning. But there is a kind of synchronous intensification of this process on a kind of global scale. And it's sometimes worth, if we want to sort of understand what that might mean, and I don't know what that means yet, we need to think about climatic pressures. We need to think about cultural changes in terms of cultural systems. But one way to start to think about that is to also put these things on a map and think about what's happening spatially. So if you go back to the beginning, this is just the old world. 10,000 years ago, there's very few parts of the world that have cultivation or domestication. So wheat and barley are just being domesticated. There's some evidence, though controversial, that you have a little bit of cultivation, at least, of some of the millets in China. But that's it. And then about 8,000 years ago, you've had your early Neolithic dispersal out of the Near East, and they've gone into Greece and Crete, and they've gone east as far as the Indus Valley in Pakistan and into Turkmenistan. And that's the kind of wheat barley world, the aceramic Neolithic, but it's still pretty small. And by this time, it's clear that you have established millet cultivating villages over a wide part of North China, and your first sort of beginnings of rice cultivation. This is still before that rice evidence I've worked on in China. And there's some claims that maybe there's rice cultivation and management in North India, still somewhat problematic. But there's not a lot going on at that period. So you roll forward another couple thousand years to 6,000 years ago, you had your big Neolithic expansion through Europe and the Mediterranean. So by 3,800 BC, you've got barley farming on the Scottish Isles, and you've got wheat and barley farming in Ireland. But it hasn't moved much past the Indus Valley. It's moved into Egypt and into Morocco. So there's been this big expansion. In the east, you have the millet cultures in the north of China, and by this time, well-established rice farming cultures around the Yangtze Valley. And some interesting things happening in New Guinea in terms of things like veggiculture, early bananas, early taro, sago palm, maybe. But again, it's mostly a world of hunter-gatherers out there. About 5,000 years ago, you've had further expansions of the wheat and barley farmers into Arabia and northern Ethiopia and Libya. You have clearly established some rice cultivation in the Ganges Plain, a kind of growing of the Chinese rice and millet system. And then maybe the beginnings of cultivation of some of the African millets and some of the South Indian millets. This is probably about when they start. And then at about 4,000 years ago is when these different systems start to butt up against each other and interact and exchange crops. And it's what I would think we could think of it as in West Asian or European terms. It's the Bronze Age, and it's a kind of the age of Bronze Age world systems. It's the first time when you get evidence for really long-distance trade and intercultural contact in a big way. And so you have wheat and barley spreading into India, but there's all these green dots represent the dispersal of millets, Chinese millets, and African millets coming to India, Chinese millets coming into southeastern Europe, and by 4,000 years ago, you get your first finds of wheat in central China. So wheat is coming into China, Chinese millets are going out, rice spreads throughout Southeast Asia, and so in some sense, this is a kind of Neolithization of much of the old world. And then, of course, that just increases as you move through time. So increased networking and increased regional interaction. And what you see in these periods is this is when lots of crops from far away, African millets in India, Asian millets in Europe, Chinese rice in Southeast Asia, and so forth, are being introduced into new places. And this correlates roughly with when that domestication curve stops. So people stop domesticating new species because you have all these intercultural communication, which is which is introducing new species into your region. So rather than spending 2,000 years domesticating it, you can adopt something that's from someplace else. You can innovate through a translocation of a species from someplace else. So I wonder whether there's not, in the end, some sort of correlation, that as we get these world systems, this long-distance networking, it actually counteracts against new domestication. So it's easier to adopt something domesticated than to start the process again. And if we reflect, yeah, there's my little arrows in networking. So if we reflect back on and again, this is just looking at parts of the old world, but some of the sort of orthodoxies we started with, is the origin of agriculture synchronous? Not really. Is it the same cause? Probably not, but there are probably similar factors, but there are similar processes involved. So we can actually study these processes and look in particular cases at what factors are involved. And there are some interesting differences that we still need to explain. So when we look at the old world, some of these areas, and you can see this on the chart here, this represents early pottery in relation to cultivation and domestication of plants and domesticated animals. The little huts represent sedentary village life. And in some parts of the world, you have a pre-agricultural pottery, and that's true in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's true in Eastern Asia. So the cooking technologies of boiling precede the domestication of plants, and I suspect that then sets up how those early plants are processed. So rice and millets are boiled, and they're steamed, and that creates whole cultures of cooking to which new species are added and fit into that. And that precedes agriculture, so there's some cultural determinism there. And then in Western Asia, it's an aceramic Neolithic, so there's a pre-pottery stage, and pottery is added long after grain crops are domesticated. And the emphasis in Western Asia is really on grinding stones to make flour and ovens. So ovens precede pottery by a couple thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 years in the Near East. In sites like Çatalhöyük, every house has an oven. So ovens are very, bread making is the kind of the cultural, the sort of cultural tradition. And that's to some extent then selecting how crops come into cultivation systems. So there's some interesting questions here, which I don't think I can really answer about what's really driving it. But if we come back to those sort of 3 points I started with, I think we can now look around the world, and there's good evidence for lots of centers, not everywhere, but lots of centers of independent origin, something like 20. And within these, there's often a mosaic sort of process. And within them, domestication is slow. So where we have quantifiable evidence, we're looking at domestication of taking 2,000 to 3,000 years. That's 100 human generations rather than one or a few. And that's really a subsequent evolution. Varietal diversification may be much more local, and it may be much more rapid, but it's a different set of processes. Equally, the transition from using purely wild foods to using mainly agricultural foods is a gradual one. It's not a sudden revolution. And chronologically, very few domestications actually start 11,000 years ago at the big climatic change at the end of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Holocene. And most of them are actually focused in the later mid-Holocene, the kind of 6,000 to 3,000 years ago window. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but it raises interesting questions. And then they kind of slow down and stop. And I suggest that intercultural networking may well work against further grain domestication. And that, I think, maybe reflects back on this notion. There used to be an idea that there were very few centers of origin of agriculture because it was kind of a difficult thing to do, and so people wouldn't do it. And so you're more likely to do it under the influence of somebody else. But I would argue that you're more likely, if you're under the influence of somebody who's got agriculture, to adopt crops from them than start from scratch. And so I think that that's what the longer chronological view might be showing. And so I would just like to make a plug for my field, archaeobotany, that I think we can say something interesting about the world we live in, about the crops that we depend on, and how the world has become an artifact. And we have to do it by balancing both looking at the micro, those little 400 micron rice phycobases, and the macro, looking at the bigger pattern. Thank you.